first step in beginning your final presentation board is to cut out your compositions. The presentation board will showcase 11 of the best examples, one of each concept, and a 12th composition of your choosing, which will be your wild card. You will choose your strongest designs to display on the presentation board. When you begin to cut, make sure you have a new X-Acto blade so that the edges are sharp. Cut carefully and slowly so that you do not tear the edges of the paper. For the square and rectangular compositions, it'd be best to use a ruler so that your lines are straight and the edges are sharp. When cutting out the circular composition, make sure to cut slowly and steadily, and rotate your paper as you go to make this a little bit easier. We don't want to see jagged edges like this, or the black outlines of any of your compositions on your presentation board. You'll create and print labels for every single composition. The labels for the compositions on the presentation board will actually need to be printed twice, so that you have an additional label for the binder as well. Include the composition number and the concept on the label. To save yourself some time and energy later, it might be helpful to type the labels in columns on Word or Excel so that every label is lined up and you can make more consistent cuts. Most importantly, leave enough room around each label so that you can cut it and still have a little extra white space. You'll also need to make an additional label that goes on the bottom of the presentation board that has your name and your group name on it. When typing the labels, make sure you use a simple and easy to read font. Sans serif fonts are preferred, and never use a script font. The size of the font should be about 10 to 12 points. When you trim your labels, try to center the word in the middle of the white space. You can always go back and trim off a little excess if you need to. Just try to make sure your labels stay the same height. Try to make sure all of your labels are the same height. You can use the ruler on your cutting mat to keep them fairly consistent. You have the option of cutting your presentation board to any size that fits your compositions well, and orienting it how you like. If you buy a piece of mat board that's larger than the size you need, then you'll need to cut it down. For the purpose of this demo, I'm using a black mat board, but you have the option of using black or gray. I'm cutting mine to 20 by 30 inches and arranging my compositions vertically. Make sure you use a fresh and sharp X-Acto blade. Don't rush this process, and don't try to cut the board in one pass. You should use several passes, bearing down firmly but not forcing the blade to cut. Let the blade do the work for you. This will ensure a clean cut and a precise edge. Sometimes it takes over 10 passes to finally cut the mat board. We don't want to see any jagged edges on the mat board either, or any small pieces falling off like this. Make sure you take your time so that your cuts are all clean. You also want to make sure your mat board is stored in a safe location where it's not going to get dented and banged up just like this corner is. Now that you have your board cut to size, you can begin to lay out your 12 compositions. Think of this presentation board as one large composition. The arrangement of the shapes of your compositions should feel well balanced. Spread out the circular compositions from each other, as well as the rectangular. Don't create emphasis in one specific area of the board. Take your time with this layout because it's one of the first things all of your viewers will notice. Once you have your layout, you can begin to measure and mark your board. You'll want at least 2.5 inches between each of the compositions and around the border of the board. The bottom border should actually be slightly larger so that it does not feel weighted down. Measure 2.5 inches in from each corner and make a small tick mark on the board. Make sure this tick mark is light. I've used an H pencil so that it's easier to erase. You can also make a small tick mark 2.5 inches in from the center of the board just to help line up your ruler. Align your ruler with the small tick marks you just made. This will create the top border for your first row of compositions. Now you can start placing the first row of compositions down. When I placed my top corner compositions, I tried to line them up with the small tick mark I had made 2.5 inches in from each side of the board. To be more specific, I made another small tick mark farther down, 2.5 inches in, so that I can be sure my composition is sitting against the vertical border. Now that this corner composition is aligned, I'm making very small tick marks at each corner of the square. I want to make all my tick marks very lightly, that way I'll be able to erase them easily later. You shouldn't have any pencil marks on your presentation board by the time that you turn it in. Now you can repeat this process on the opposite side. Now that I'm placing my circular composition, I want to make sure it's centered between each of the outside compositions. Measure to the center of your board and make a small tick mark. Then measure to the center of your composition and make a very light tick mark as well. You can visually align both of these points to make sure your composition is centered. I want to make all my tick marks very lightly, that way I'll be able to erase them easily later. We don't want to see any pencil marks on your presentation board by the time that you're done. You always want to make sure your labels are closer to the composition that they correspond with rather than any other composition on the board. Since all of these compositions are the same height, all of my labels will also be at the same height for this row. For this row, I can make a small tick mark 1/4 of an inch below each of the side compositions. Line up your ruler to each of these tick marks and make a very light and small straight line under the center of each composition. The top of each label will rest on this line. When you're centering your labels to each of the compositions, you may measure the center of each composition as well as the center of each label and line up the marks. I'm placing the next row of compositions 2.5 inches below the first row. The second row of compositions will probably include different shapes than the previous row. Instead of lining up the edges to the borders, you'll actually center the compositions to the compositions directly above them. Since the vertical rectangles are 1 inch smaller than the 4-inch square compositions above them, I know they will need an extra 1/2 inch on each side. This means the vertical rectangles will actually sit 3 inches in from the outside of the board. Since I know the top of the vertical rectangles will be 2.5 inches from the first row of compositions and will sit 3 inches in, I can go ahead and mark my corners for these compositions. The horizontal rectangle in the middle is a bit different. It will need to be centered below the circular composition, as well as centered height-wise in between the vertical rectangles. Since I know the horizontal rectangle is an inch shorter than the vertical rectangles, I can come in an extra ½ inch from the top and from the bottom of the composition. This means the horizontal rectangle will sit 3 inches below the circular composition. Now that I have this one centered, I can mark all of my corners with small tick marks. When placing the labels for the second row, not all of the labels will be on the same line. The center label will actually be higher and closer to its composition than the labels for the vertical compositions. I can place the labels for the vertical rectangles the same way I did for the first row of labels, marking 1/4 inch below each of the compositions and creating a top line that the label will rest on. I'll have to do this individually for the center composition, marking 1/4 inch down from the horizontal rectangle and placing the label on that line. Center the labels just as you did in the previous row. Continue repeating this process until you have all of your compositions placed on the board. The board should look something like this, well spaced and with the labels close enough to each composition so that they are easy to read and associate with their compositions. Don't forget to place your 13th label with your name and your group name at the bottom of the board. I'm aligning this label with the very bottom right composition. You'll attach all of your compositions to your boards using spray mount. Spray mount is only to be used outside in the designated area. Outside the sculpture studio is a blue tarp with a sign on it. This is where you will use your spray mount. Lay down a sheet of newsprint on the tarp before spraying to keep the tarp from getting sticky. Make sure the area is clear of any debris or leaves before you start spraying. When using spray mount, always spray at a distance of at least 1 foot. Try to spray lightly and evenly. Spraying too close to your compositions will cause glue spots to show up on the other side. You don't need a lot of spray mount to be able to stick your designs down to the presentation board. You certainly don't need this much. After spraying, wait several seconds for the glue to become tacky, and then gently lift your composition with your finger. Place your composition carefully on the presentation board, aligning it with the tick marks you made before. Place a separate clean sheet of paper on top of the composition to rub it down until it is stuck. Your fingers might be sticky or have excess glue on them from picking up your compositions, and you don't want this glue to get on the front of your compositions or on your presentation board. Repeat this process with all of your compositions and labels. Always spray on the back of your compositions or whatever it is you're placing down. Never spray on your presentation board directly or cover the entire board with spray mount.